Equality has been a significant part of Australian society. However, over the past decade, schools are being urged to give primacy to greed, competition, and marketisation, excluding and silencing Indigenous students to the point where they switch off and reject the institution of schooling. Schools work well for some groups of students, but not for all. Indigenous students, or those groups who experience some form of marginalisation in society, are less likely to perform well at school and are more likely to leave earlier than their more affluent peers. Non-Indigenous students are more likely to do better in school as their language, social structures, values and narratives are more closely aligned with typical schooling practices. This type of inequality is a matter of social justice and, therefore, it is important for educators to ensure that the culture of Indigenous students is not undervalued in educational processes. Furthermore, it is crucial for schools not to disparage, stereotype, or normalise Indigenous students, but rather to learn from them and their families. To explore this issue, this essay will first outline the problems that Indigenous students face as a result of exclusion, describe the current position of the Australian schooling system and how it influences the silencing of Indigenous students, delve into the hidden curriculum, discuss relevant implications for educators, and conclude with recommendations for the future. Indigenous Australians are one of the most disadvantaged Indigenous groups in the world. Schools that exclude, silence, and normalise are largely responsible for the inequality and outcomes that see Indigenous students suffer. Attendance rates for Indigenous students are lower than the rate for non-Indigenous students, at 82% and 93% comparatively. Additionally, Indigenous students tend to leave school earlier and have lower retention rates than their non-Indigenous peers. Racism and low teacher expectations leads to marginalisation of Indigenous students and can often result in low self-belief, motivation and engagement. Indigenous students generally achieve lower academic results than their non-Indigenous peers. In 2017, a large percentage of Indigenous students remain below the national minimum standards in reading and numeracy. Furthermore, a disproportionately low number of Indigenous students participated in the National Assessment Program, Literacy and Numeracy, NAPLAN. Large shares of Indigenous students come from a lower social class background, and therefore they usually attend low socioeconomic public schools. Power relations continue to exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people since invasion. These past injustices have seen many Indigenous students struggle with a lack of identity, self-esteem, and a sense of belonging in school. Developing a sense of belonging at school is generally easier for white Australian students. The Australian schooling system has been localised to create an Australian version of the British system, and, therefore, it has been embedded with Western historical, social and cultural contexts. Schools in Australia represent a monolingual and hegemonic system. The privilege of whiteness can be seen in the school, playground and classroom. Moreover, the overwhelming population of teacher education students at Australian universities that attended the same white, middle-class Anglo-Australian schools reaffirms this racial hierarchy. White teachers and white students unintentionally manifest the white race privilege. The dominant culture in most Australian schools is generally normalised. Normalisation of culture occurs when the features of one culture is privileged over the features of other cultures. In this case, the culture of Indigenous students versus the culture of non-Indigenous white students. Normalising the white culture is damaging and results in Indigenous students being excluded and silenced, as their ideals are not recognised. A student from a remote Aboriginal school would not have the same cultural capital as a student who lives in a middle-class suburb in Perth would have. Consequently, centralised tests, schooling processes, classroom routines, and behavioural expectations become discriminatory. It is no surprise, therefore, that, on average, non-Indigenous students achieve better academic results, have higher attendance rates, stay in school longer, and have more motivation and self-belief than their Indigenous peers. Mainstream schools are often assimilatory and, as a result, threaten the cultural identities of Indigenous students. When students enter school, they bring with them a virtual school bag full of their own ideas on culture, values, practices, and worldviews. Generally, in Australia, the hidden curriculum is largely based on the virtual school bag of white Australians, and therefore Indigenous students are often left feeling alienated and silenced. The dominant Australian culture is often normalised in schools, which results in a silencing of Indigenous culture because their language, social structures, values and narratives are not recognised. While Indigenous communities have rich cultures that should be proudly shared in classrooms, they do not tend to carry the educational codes that are valued in Australian schools. Consequently, non-Indigenous students consistently do better at school because their background aligns more closely with schooling practices. It is easier for students who speak the same language than they do at home as at school to succeed in their education. In school, students are expected to meet the learning and behavioural expectations of their teachers, which, in turn, in Australia, usually means waiting quietly, completing work on time, keeping busy and on task, cooperating in groups, respecting authority, using manners, keeping quiet when the teacher is talking, and seeking permission before moving around the classroom. These expectations result in a cultural mismatch between home and school life for Indigenous students. Aboriginal children are often encouraged to be self-reliant, determining their own boundaries and resolving their own conflicts. Additionally, they rely less on adult authority and, therefore, generally follow different rules of communication and politeness than what is expected at schools. As a result, if Indigenous students are to have any chance of succeeding in school, they must take on an identity that is aligned with the values and practices of mainstream society, which often differs from their own. Many Aboriginal students have to alter their distinct ways of learning to receive a formal education. As schools exclude and silence Indigenous groups in this way, they send a damaging message to students, their families, and the school community that the shared history of Indigenous Australians is not a valued part of their educational mission. Accordingly, it is crucial that teachers ensure that the cultures of Indigenous students are not silenced, excluded, or undervalued in their classroom. The implications of how silencing and exclusion can impact marginalised children needs to be more deeply understood by educators and school systems to make a positive difference in the lives of Indigenous students. It is important for schools to act as social institutions that equally develop the interests and life chances of all students, not the interests of the economy or government organisations. They need to overcome the overwhelming concern with their self-image and work humanely with the diversity of students that present themselves. There is no evidence that suggests that Aboriginal students should have to change their identity to succeed in education. Alternatively, it is crucial that schools incorporate and encourage the cultures of all students, rather than creating walls and segregating different groups of people. Indigenous students need to feel as though the school that they attend belongs to them just as much as it does to their non-Indigenous peers. The lives of Indigenous students deserve to be included in the classroom so that the differences in values between the home life and classroom merge. Educators need to consistently work towards the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, Standard 1.4, Strategies for Teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Students, and Standard 2.4, Understand and Respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People to promote reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. To do this, they must consistently teach Aboriginal history and culture willingly and knowledgeably in their classroom, and not as a token teaching content. If an educator chooses not to embrace the world of their Indigenous students, then learning becomes a one-way process. Educators should purposely plan for, support, and develop the identities of each student, and understand that students come to the classroom with different cultural preferences and skills. Additionally, it is important for educators to be proactive in talking to, researching, interacting, and networking with the Indigenous community in their geographical area, getting them involved as partners in the process of encouraging the voices of Indigenous students. Educators should seek out the Aboriginal elders in their community and be aware of the language groups within the area. The more an educator socialises with the Indigenous community, the more applications of cross-cultural teaching will be implemented into their classroom. In Australia's current educational system, preoccupied with self-image and self-importance, there is something seriously damaging with the way that schools are impacting the lives of students, particularly those marginalised in society. Schools are, more than ever, silencing Indigenous students and normalising the Anglo-Australian Western culture. As a result, Indigenous students have low attendance rates, low retention rates, low academic results, and low participation in NAPLAN. Additionally, they experience lower teacher expectations, which results in diminished self-belief and self-belonging. The counterproductivity that results from silencing and normalising different groups of students primarily comes from an unchanged Euro-Anglo-Saxon Western-dominated educational system, and the alarmingly large proportion of teachers who, themselves, come from a white, middle-class, Anglo-Australian background. Each student comes to school with a virtual school bag full of their own ideas on culture, values, practices, and worldviews. Generally, the curriculum is based on the virtual school bag of the dominant culture, and Indigenous students are often silenced and excluded. Consequently, to succeed at school, Indigenous students must take on an identity that aligns with the practices of mainstream society, which usually differs from their own. The implications of how silencing and excluding can impact Aboriginal children needs to be more deeply understood by teachers in order to make a positive difference in their lives. Indigenous students should not have to alter their identity in order to succeed at school. Instead, schools should encourage and incorporate the cultures of all their students, teach Aboriginal studies consistently in their classrooms, network with the Indigenous community, seek and create partnerships with Aboriginal elders, and apply cross-cultural teaching practices at any opportunity that arises. Additionally, it is recommended that educational institutions diversify the representation of different cultures in their teaching population, and that all student teachers be provided with mandatory Indigenous student studies in their teacher training courses. In this ideal, educators will become accepting, supportive, and inspiring role models for all of their students, and hopefully Australia will be one step closer to closing the gap.